And joining me to talk more about the investigation of possible war crimes is Professor of Law at Emory Law School and the author of International Law and Armed Conflict, Laurie Blank. Thanks for being here, Laurie.
Thanks for having me.
First up here, we've seen reports on alleged attacks by Russia in Ukraine. That story illustrated some of them. Alleged attacks on a kindergarten building, an apartment building. Last night, a nuclear power plant. Do you think that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is justified at this time for investigating Russia and President Putin?
Absolutely. It's important to investigate any alleged or suspected crimes. In fact, states have an obligation to investigate all suspected breaches of international law during wartime. They are supposed to be doing that with respect to their own people. They're supposed to be doing that with respect to others. And that's how we make sure that we gather this evidence and try to hold as many people accountable as possible.
Yeah, and talk more about what constitutes a war crime, because it's got a particular focus, doesn't it? And is it limited? How is it limited? And how are civilians supposed to be protected?
So a war crime is actually exactly what it sounds like. It's a crime committed during wartime. But more specifically, there is a body of law that applies during war. It's called the law of war or the law of armed conflict. And a war crime is a serious violation of that law. So the law is designed to protect civilians and minimize suffering during armed conflict. So a killing of a civilian is going to be a war crime. Bombing a hospital is going to be a war crime. Attacking any kind of civilian object that's not being used for military purposes, that's going to be a war crime.
There are all questions about if something were to happen to President Zelensky, what might be the punishment for that? That's another thing that a lot of people are discussing at this time. But I want to ask you, too, does the fact that Ukrainian citizens are taking up arms and fighting against Russian troops complicate matters or complicate an investigation?
It does, because once they take up arms, they're in the fight, which is going to change their protection from attack, which means it's going to change whether or not attacks on those particular civilians who are fighting would be a violation of the law. There's no rule that says civilians cannot pick up weapons and join the fight. There's a consequence, which is that they're not protected from attack at that time anymore, which makes sense purely as a matter of common sense in that situation. But it complicates the battlefield because it gets harder to figure out who is who's protected, and who can be attacked in the course of the fighting.
Well, this is your area of expertise, so I want to ask you, considering history, how difficult is it to prosecute a war criminal or these crimes?
It's difficult for a couple of reasons. Partly because you're trying to work with evidence in a courtroom that is coming from a battlefield. And a battlefield is a highly chaotic and highly dynamic space. So simply gathering that information is very difficult. It also requires being able to demonstrate the intent of the perpetrator in most cases. And that's also difficult. How do you get in the head of somebody? How do you prove their intent in the midst of combat operations? So to the extent there's documents, that's always really helpful. Intent can be inferred from the circumstances. Attacking a kindergarten when there's nothing military near it, it's probably reasonable that, it wasn't, it may well have been intentional. Right. It may have been a mistake. You need to try to figure that out. But these are the challenges of almost any criminal case. One of the other challenges is actually getting the individual perpetrators into court, and that's going to be the biggest challenge with respect to Russia. The evidence is being gathered. That's standard for all criminal cases, but actually getting them into a court is going to be the big challenge.
Emory Law Professor Laurie Blank, we appreciate your time and your expertise on this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.